also meet all applicable research and publication standards like consort guidelines, care guidelines, or SIGA guidelines. So especially if you're doing clinical trials, consort is the guidelines, that checklist you need to follow and fill out and then submit. So ensuring that the ethical approval is clearly stated. I will talk about ethical approval in a moment. And adhering to our data availability policy, where all the underlying data and the results should be provided in an open online data repository, which again, I will talk in a couple of minutes. Now, moving on to ethical approval. To go into ethical approval in more detail for all the studies involving humans. Now, when I say human subjects, I mean anything from drug experimentation to interviews to online surveys. We require an ethical approval statement. Now, ethical approval should have been obtained prior to the study being conducted. You may also need to apply for ethical approval for certain animal studies. And if you did not need ethical approval for your study, you will need a clear statement in the article that explains why your study did not require that you obtain ethical approval. Now, in the screenshot on your slide, you can see a very good example of an ethics statement from an article. It has very clearly stated what are the information that is required, which is the institution, the review board name, permit number. So all these ethical considerations need to be clearly stated. Even it is required in social sciences research as well. So if you're submitting a survey, an interview, or a questionnaire, or anything involves data from the humans, even if it is online or in person, it needs to have an ethical approval statement. Now, we are talking about data, but what exactly is research data? Research data may either be the input or the output of your research process. Depending on the design of your study, and the format of this data will depend on this design as well as your research discipline. So if you are a researcher in life sciences, your data set will be different as compared to somebody who is a researcher in social sciences background. So data set in spreadsheets, which are Excel sheets, is fairly common. But data can also take the form of images, videos, audio recordings. If you've done any interviews and you've recorded them on your phone, so that also constitutes data. So it's entirely dependent on your research and the study. So it's a very wide term that we use here, data. Now, pre-publication checks, which are open in nature, data must be shared for all the articles unless there is a valid exemption, which I will share in a couple of minutes. What are the various valid exemptions? Data must be available in one of our F1000 recommended repositories with an open license, which I've mentioned here, which is CC0 or CC BY license, and a persistent identifier. And all articles must include a statement describing how that data can be accessed by peer reviewers and readers. I will give you an example of how it looks like in a minute. Now, these are some of the valid exemptions and exceptions that we have. Now, first exemption is authors who did not generate or use the data. Second exemption is data which cannot be shared for ethical or security reason, which could be to protect the privacy of your research participants. Third, that data sets which are too large to upload to a repository. Fourth is that data owned by third party, which was reused by the author. So these are the 4 exemptions that we allow on F1000. So if your paper and your data study falls under any of these 4 categories, you can apply for an exemption. However, if you feel that you have some data which you cannot share and the exemption does not fall within these 4 categories, you can reach out to me or anyone from the editorial team, and they will be able to help you out and make you understand, help you understand if your data set falls under exemptions or not. Now, what do authors need to do? This is again important when you're thinking about how you can comply with F1000 open data policy. It is also important to note some of the preparatory steps that you will need to take before you submit your article or even before you start your research. Now, at the beginning of your research project, you may need to draft a data management plan. Now, in some cases, your funder will prompt you to create this plan as part of your grant funding submission. If you do create a data management plan, it will help you with all the decisions that you make to prepare your data for sharing as you conduct your research. Now, at this point, you may also consider where your future data set will be stored. For example, which data repository you will use. Again, this will help to guide you when you think about documenting your data set for future sharing. Now, before you submit the data set to a repository, you will need to prepare it for appropriate sharing, which means that your study involved human research participants. You will need to anonymize the data before it can be shared. Additionally, you will need to write some descriptive text to accompany your data set into the repository, which is the metadata. And you may also wish to check that the data itself will be understood by other people. So if I am reading your data and you are the researcher, you will have to make sure that all the headers don't include any acronyms that you have not explained, and that the unit of measurement have been defined and are consistent throughout. So these minor details need to be taken care of. Now, when you're ready with your data, you will upload that in a repository. And then when it has been deposited, you can draft your data availability statement in your manuscript when you're submitting to your gateway. Now, just to give you an idea of what are the different type of data in your study. Now, underlying data means that data that underlie the results of the study. So it can either be the raw data that you have accumulated or the source data. What is raw data? Raw data is all the output data the authors have gathered in their study. For example, uncropped Western blots, survey results, sequences, transcripts, spectra. So all of this comprises raw data. Authors must upload all of this data to the repository, which I had shown you, Dataverse, Figshare, etc. What is source data? Source data is all the input data that the authors analyzed in their study. For example, data set used from other researchers, demographic health survey data that you have analyzed within your study. So authors need to provide information about where they obtained this source data. So you can see what the difference is between the raw data and the source data here. Now there's another type of data which is called extended data. Extended data means material which is equivalent to your supplementary material. For example, questionnaires, consent statements, statistical analysis, calculation, all of this comes in the extended data. Authors can choose to share this information, but they do not need to provide any materials that do not impact the reproducibility of the results. Authors must upload all of these to a data repository. Now moving on to reporting guidelines. So certain study types also require reporting guidelines, especially in clinical trials, which are the consort guidelines, which are for clinical trials. Then you have SPIRIT guidelines, which are for clinical trial protocols, PRISMA guidelines, which are for systemic reviews, PRISMA P for systemic reviews protocols, and ARRIVE guidelines, which are for in vivo animal studies. Now, these reporting guideline checklists should be filled out and all the information provided in the article. And this checklist must also be uploaded to the data repository. Now, what is a data availability statement? Every article needs to have a data availability statement. So if any one of you have published on F1000Reserch, you would know what a data availability statement is. And an example of which is also on your screen as a screenshot from a paper, how it looks like in practice. It will appear towards the end of your paper, which is after the conclusion. You can see data availability, underlying and extended data, and reporting guidelines. All the three information is clearly mentioned. And some of the examples are also there, so I'll just show you. Now, this is an example with underlying raw data. So how will you mention that? So you have the Figshare title, your DOI. The project contains following underlying data. So what is the file name? If it is raw unavaged PCR data or raw Western blot images. So all of the information is here. And the license image information is also here. So it's Creative Commons 0, no rights reserved data waiver. What are the key requirements? Subheading for what type of data it is, the repository name, title of your data set, the URL, the citation, and information about the files in the repository, and then the licenses. So this is for underlying data. Here is an example of how it looks like in a repository. So we have used Figshare repository here to show you how exactly it looks like when you are uploading it. All of the information is here, and on the next side you can see how it appears when you're drafting it. So you have the Figshare detail, you have the DOI, you have the citation and information on what type of license it is. So all of the information is very clearly stated. Now the next example is about the extended data. So you have the key requirements, which are subheading for what type of data it is, the name of the repository, the title of the data set, the DOI, citation, information about the file in the repository, and the license. So here you can see that again it's Figshare, what is the title of your project, the DOI, then what is the extended data? There are supplementary figures and tables in questionnaire. So it's very clearly stated, supplementary table 1, figure 2, figure 1, and the questionnaire. So this is an ideal example of extended data. Here you can see an example from a published article on F1000Reserch, how it appears on your article. So this is how it will appear. Same format that we see that we saw in the previous slide. The name of the title, DOI, what all extending data is there. So there are tables, table 1 to table 6, and then there are 3 figures. All of this is very clearly mentioned. So it's very easy, very simple to do that, and this is how it appears. Now, if you are uploading an article which comes with a data exemption, the 4 points that I mentioned, even then you will need to write a data availability statement, and it must contain why the data is restricted, all the necessary information required for a reader to apply for access. So if it is stored in a restricted repository, how can you apply for the access, the conditions under which that access will be granted, and the requirements depending on the exemption. Now here is an example of a data availability statement, which is a restricted data. So you can see that the data set can be accessed by completing the request form, which requires that the intended use for data is specified. So if you are a researcher, you want to access the data on the ophthalmologists in training in Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa, you need to apply for the access, get the request form, and share your intention behind using the data. Now, these are some generic examples of the data availability statement, so I'll quickly go through them. This is the first one where your data is clearly available for anyone to use and reuse. It has a CC0 public domain license. You can see that it is very clearly mentioned that the data is in the form of Excel spreadsheet, and it is shared for everyone. This is the second example, which is a restricted data availability example. So you need to register, and only then people who are reading your article will get access to your data set only for legitimate research purposes. If there is no data, this is how it looks like. You still need to draft a data availability statement which says no data are associated with this article.